Well, howdy, folks, and welcome back to Volume 6 of Sorority Security Guard. As promised, we'll be filling in some gaps about little things that were going on, some stories about guards, and also, as promised, we will move into the final phase of Zimco. And we'll start talking about the elements that eventually brought the whole thing crashing down. It was a lot like the ending of The Godfather, or Goodfellas, or Casino. Also, RoboCop, in a way, and we'll talk about that. And of course, in this scenario, I'm RoboCop. The 25% Native American ancestry has made my face permanently straight. A lot of people have said that I would make a very good poker player. I think it's the result of too much Arctic warfare among tribal cultures in my ancestry. I think that tends to maybe reduce the voluntary nerve activity in your face. It could be an adaptation to the cold, and also, you don't want to look scared in a close-up fight with somebody. You want to look like you always are tough and you know what you're doing, and you have a purpose, and don't mess with me. You always want to give off that vibe. And my face just naturally gives that vibe off anytime I'm not actually talking. So, once again, that was helpful for someone who wanted to do security for a living. I definitely gave the impression that I'm not a pleasant person to argue with or fight with, and it may not work out well for you. But, as Ron always said, it wasn't about bone crushing. We solve problems with our brains. We are gentlemen. We are security consultants. We're not attack dogs. And so I found out with Zimco that a lot of private security, as I've said before, has nothing to do with intimidation or physical force. And that you could attract a lot more flies with honey than vinegar, as they always used to say. And I could switch from quiet and intimidating to hyper-verbal and friendly at the drop of a hat. My appearance was always meticulous. And it's interesting, a guard with a very, very careful uniform, who also seems to have the physicality to project an authoritative vibe, I guess you could say. Guards who had that combination are particularly unsettling to people, because I've always said that your big guys who were very physical, well over 6 feet tall, getting around a lean 250 pounds. Guys like the rugby player, or my roommate, Jason, who was the bodybuilder. Those guys, a lot of times, are sweethearts. They're nice guys. They don't want to rip anybody's head off, even though they totally could. It's usually the guy who had to do some training to become dangerous who is a real problem. And, I'm not at the rugby player or bodybuilder level of physical intimidation. But, like I said, there's something about the meticulous uniform that's off-putting to people. Because I think subconsciously they're thinking, he takes things way too seriously. The dude makes barely above minimum wage, and he's making sure his slacks are creased? Come on. This Vincent guy will show up at 3 a.m. and make the guard on duty put his tie back on and button his shirt up, even though everybody's asleep and nobody can see the guard. But that's just the level of crazy that I brought. And it makes people think, what is up with this guy? I mean, we're guarding glorified fancy dorms on West Campus, and yet here's this Vincent guy who seems to think that he's a main character in the sequel to Full Metal Jacket, Full Metal Jacket 2, Electric Boogaloo. Well, life for a Zimco supervisor was strange, as I mentioned before. I did want to say that I did have the 2 guards that were working at the Church of Scientology.
The Church of Scientology. The Church of Scientology.
But I also had 2 guards that were seminary students. They were training to be ministers. This particular seminary actually offered some classes that I went to in classics, because they had some faculty that were really good with Greek and also with Hebrew. Now, in the proper classical civilization, we don't really deal with Hebrew much. In fact, you could argue that Semitic languages are probably excluded to a problematic degree because of the importance of languages like Egyptian, which is Semitic. But, nope, they stick with the Indo-European languages. Anyway, this was before I actually took my seminary courses to finish up my classics degree. I had just started, so I didn't know these seminary guys, but, obviously, they were cool guys. We got along. They had a couple of rules that they had trouble following, though. One was that you don't walk around off the property when you're not wearing your uniform. Now, you could leave your dorm or apartment and walk to the property or take the bus, and you can be in your uniform, that's okay, but you gotta go straight there. You're not supposed to go to a coffee shop and hang out with people in your uniform on another property that you're not contracted to guard. That is a great recipe for getting hassled or assaulted for no good reason. It also could be very bad advertising for Zimco. There was this restaurant geared for students on Rio Grande at the time. Again, that candy lane of love and beauty and innocence and excessive alcohol consumption. And so these seminary students weren't going there to drink. They were there for the bottomless chicken wings. So this place had like a deal where if you ate a certain amount of chicken wings, a really unreasonable amount of chicken wings, you'd win some kind of prize, and they'd take a Polaroid of you and they would tack it to a bulletin board near the front of the restaurant. So we had a rule that, 1, you were supposed to head straight to your property. Don't loiter on another property in your uniform. And we also had a rule that if you're going to go eat somewhere for lunch, you don't eat in your uniform in that restaurant. Once again, it can cause problems when you're in that rent-a-cop outfit and you're not on the property that you're guarding. We tried to make that clear to people, but, some people wouldn't listen. In fact, there was also the rule that you don't leave romantic notes for residents and you don't put them in their mailbox, but the one guy that I mentioned earlier who wrote a couple of lines about this one girl's beautiful eyes that we had to part ways with, he was one of the seminary students. And this is part of why I referred to him as a hopeless romantic. He just always thought that you should be open for romance when it comes crashing into your life. And I'm trying to explain to him that in my classical civ studies, I'm finding out that romance is a cultural trap set for young people in order to try to get them to marry young and marry people that they're not supposed to marry. Romance is a way of encouraging the whole leave it to beaver, white picket fence type marriage stuff, which is great for population growth and for economic prosperity in certain contexts. It can definitely go too far. But now, looking at our genetics, we have found out that we don't come from romantic ancestors. That this romance started after the fall of the Roman Empire. And it was a medieval and early modern fantasy trying to shape human behavior to something more pleasant than what we found in front of us. And what do we find in front of us? Well, the pattern that we have returned to in full force, which is that humans have somewhere between 6 to 11 female ancestors for every one male ancestor. So, we are all the descendants of a vast ocean of women and a tiny handful of men. Now, how exactly that worked is probably going to be an unpleasant story. And I think that's why we have so much sort of residual resentment in the population. If you imagine that probably most of the women of these 6 to 11 women who are our ancestors for every one male ancestor, probably the majority of those women didn't choose that guy freely. And it appears that over time, I suspect that forced breeding of women throughout human history, I think we're seeing the effects of it now. Everyone's talking about the birth rate collapse and how, nobody's having kids now. Well, I'm thinking that might be just what happens when the descendants of these people who long ago were forced to have families, forced to have children, that desire to live child-free, as they say, didn't go away. It just got buried in the quiet attitudes of the descendants. And so around 1970, when the cultural and biological barriers to being child-free were fully removed, and the expectations on women's reproduction went from 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7 children to 2 or 1 or 0, then all of a sudden we plummeted faster in some areas than in others for cultural and economic reasons. But I think there might be a kind of paying the piper thing that we have to do now. With the chickens coming home to roost, of all of the bad behavior of our ancestors. And so now we have to sort of sort out our true feelings about family in the future in a culture where people can literally do whatever they want. So it's going to be chaotic for a while, folks. But the one thing I can tell you is that biology wins in the end. It will always win. And then physics rules over biology. And we've got some problems related to physics coming up. Anyway, that was definitely on the subject. But back to our seminary students. So, I'm hungry one night, and I'm in my supervisor uniform, but I'm just picking up my order. I stopped by this place with the bottomless chicken wings on Rio Grande to pick up some lunch in the middle of the night. My 3 a.m. dinners of greasy food and black coffee. That is really great stuff for your digestive tract. It was a very healthy diet. And so I go in there to pick up my order, and I look at a bulletin board that they have near the front door, and I see right in the middle this Polaroid with these 2 smiling faces, very familiar faces, grinning at me. And underneath it says, congratulations for eating our ungodly number of chicken wings, or whatever the prize was, but they crossed that finish line. They showed up at some point in their uniforms and sat down in the restaurant, stuffed their faces with chicken wings for I don't know how long, until they won the prize. And then there they are, in their Zimco uniforms, in the Polaroid, smiling for everybody. And of course, that's some great advertising for Zimco. Good job, guys. You did us proud. And now let's talk a little bit about Hardin House. Again. And perhaps for the last time. Now, as someone who eventually grew up to become a father of a daughter who did eventually go to a university, I can see how the parents of these newly minted sorority freshmen would be paranoid and obsessed with their safety. However, unfortunately for the property owners, the parents, and the security guards, a large portion of the residents themselves just were not especially concerned about their own personal safety whatsoever. In fact, if a door was open, it was very likely left propped open by a resident so that someone could get in or get out in the middle of the night. And in the last volume, I promised to talk about a room raid, where we got a report that there was a man in the building. And everybody went on red alert, battle stations at the ready. So we locked down all the doors. We set the magnetic locks so that nobody's badges could open anything. And I met with one of the house mothers, who was still in her pajamas and house slippers. But she came to the front lobby where the guards were, so that one guard could go back with her to help with the search and the ousting of the unsanctioned guest. And yes, we did find a guy. But basically, once the house mother got to the room in question, he just gave up and left. He was just sort of tired and confused. But the police weren't involved because he was let in. And according to the rules, I'm not sure if they ever really enforced this the way they described it. But the idea was that if the girl didn't vouch for the guy, if she said, "Oh, no, I didn't let him in, he just showed up," well, then he's going to jail. But then if she says, "Nah, yeah, I let him in," well, then he's completely off the hook, and he can be trespassed against future visits, but he can't be sent to jail for this particular visit. However, the resident who let the guy in and caused the whole red alert search incident, she would get kicked out. There was a very long waiting list for this dorm, and so they were very keen on kicking anyone out who had a slip-up like that. Now, it was my duty, of course, as a security consultant, to figure out exactly how did this guy get in. If this is a prison for girls, then I'm going to have to do like that whole re-engineering of the escape at the end of The Shawshank Redemption. I mean, did the guy climb up in through a 100-yard sewer pipe and then broke out and then crawled through the hole in the wall that the girl had dug out with her rock hammer, patiently hammering away night after night, hunched under her poster of Justin Timberlake to hide her efforts? Well, it turns out that's not how he did it. I noticed that the guy did have a big old cowboy hat on when we made him leave. And it turns out that this guy actually came in through the front door. I didn't let him in. Another guard did. Now, what did he do? This guy's about 5'11", so in order to blend in with a group of residents, he kind of squatted down in the middle of the group. He put his cowboy hat on, which covered his face in the cameras, because the cameras point down at you. You know, they're kind of mounted in little bubbles over the doors. And so, looking down, if the guy's squatted down with a cowboy hat, you know, that's step one. And here is the coup de grace, the final piece of the puzzle that got the guy through the door. Someone put a cute little cardigan over his shoulders, nice and fluffy and pink, to kind of conceal the width of the shoulders, especially under that hat. Now, what the guard did was sort of counted up the girls that he saw, the quote-unquote girls that he saw in the camera image, and certain groups of girls tended to hang out together. And in this case, they very cleverly used that to their advantage because they sort of replaced one member of their clique with this guy, and the guard buzzed them in. He opened the door for them. And apparently, that's how he got in. But I need to make it clear, this wouldn't have happened with me. In fact, now I get to go on and talk about one of my proudest moments at Hardin House. And this was when I enforced the rules to an extreme that even the property owner themselves couldn't agree with. Their RoboCop had run amok, following his own programming. He just went too extreme. And that's just been the problem my whole life. I'm just too hardcore for people. They just can't handle me, And so we got to remember that this is 1998. This is back when George W. Bush was just our governor of Texas. He was not the target of political opinion back then that he became, of course, after the presidential election in 2000. So, as I tell this story, bear in mind that my feelings about the governor were fairly neutral. I did not have any sort of beef against George W. Bush. In particular, I had no beef against his daughter, Jenna Bush. And so let me make that clear before I go into this story. Vincent is just trying to enforce the rules. RoboCop didn't care who your daddy was. So there I am one night. It was a weekend night, like Friday or Saturday, and it's like 12:30 a.m. And on weekends, the guest hours are a little bit later, give people more time to party or study with friends or whatever. However, at 12:30 a.m., you could not enter the house unless you were A, a resident, or B, you were a sanctioned guest. You had filled out paperwork, we had your ID, we knew who you were, and if you filled out one of those forms and got approval, then the person could stay over for the night even. Obviously, they had to be female and within a certain age range. But I look up at the camera monitors, and I see a group of what appears to be residents at the door, and they hit the buzzer because they want to get in. And I don't recognize one of them. I ask for her name, and she tells me that her name is Jenna Bush. And so I ask if she has a guest pass or if they have filled out paperwork to that effect. And they say no. And so I inform them that, unfortunately, Miss Bush will not be able to enter the building, given that it's after midnight and I don't have the necessary paperwork for her. And so this is where they all freak out and they get very angry. And they talk about how bad the weather is, and they can't believe that I'm going to force the governor's daughter to sleep on the street. I explained to them that the governor's mansion is within walking distance, and they take good care of her there, and I've got a job to do, I have to enforce the rules that the property owner has set down in the contract, and there's nothing else much to talk about. So they left with a huff, and about 20 minutes later, one of the house mothers, again in her sleeping gown and her slippers, comes to the lobby, comes to the guard station, and in hushed and excited tones explains to me that I need to make an exception for Jenna Bush and go ahead and let them in. And I told her, hey, she represents the property owner. If she wants to suspend the rules in that particular instance, then sure, I'd do it then. Now that I've gotten direct instructions from the person who is authorized to speak for the owner of the property. So I opened the door, and let's face it, I was proud that I was cementing my reputation about being a stickler for the rules and a cold-blooded jerk. But, that's how I got paid. That's my bread and butter. So the summers for Zimco were a little bit different because when the sororities closed down, we didn't have enough properties to give people all the hours that they would want. And so guards knew that there was less work to do during the holidays and during the summer. And that's fine, and that was part of why a lot of Zimco's workforce consisted of young students. So during the summer, a lot of them would go home. Now, in the summer of '98, I was house sitting with my then girlfriend, now wife. And given my position, I got preferential treatment when it came to the summer assignments. So I worked primarily at Greenwood Towers, which never closed. Greenwood Towers is always open. It's in a pretty busy area, right on the southwest corner of campus. Not quite 6th Street level or downtown level problems, but we're getting there. So in the summer of '98, I would work that property and then do other patrols and answer pager calls for different alarms that go off. So, for example, that's how we knew about the pig at Kappa Sigma during the Thanksgiving break. There was a Zimco guard whose job it was to check out every sorority house, and they would go through a list of checks, pull on this door, check that window, this, and that. And they would make sure that the house was going to be in good working order whenever it opened back up. And this is the guard that, luckily, spotted the problem in the pool. Without our patrols, it could have been a lot worse. But I had to go find out what was up with that. And another thing I remember about my patrols during that time was that I was listening to that album by Radiohead, OK Computer, just over and over and over again in my car while I was on the way to some call or while I was making patrols. Yeah, and it dropped in 1997, and it definitely was one of the best albums of the 1990s. But I was probably way too into it. The biggest hit from that album, I think, was the single Karma Police. So if you listen to Karma Police, that'll give you a sense of the kind of mood that OK Computer is in. And it's not a very happy or upbeat mood. There was also a really bad U2 album that came out around that time, and I was listening to it, but, the whole time I was thinking, what happened to these guys? And it was pop. And my girlfriend and I did go to see the Pop Mart tour for that album, which they proudly told everybody was going to be in mono. And so there was one giant single speaker, or driver, whatever you want to call it, at the concert hall. And it put out this really strange, dull mono sound, which I had never experienced at a concert. That was kind of weird. And their sales were lagging at the time. And Katie and I noticed that the facility was only about halfway full. And after the end of the encore, Bono thanked everybody for coming out to support them. And it was kind of sad because you could tell he knew that something was off with that tour. Now, of course, in the 2000s, and then again in the 2010s, U2 had these gigantic tours where they've made plenty of money and they're fine, and maybe they should just rest on their laurels and not put out any more music. But enough about U2. It's just what I remember about that summer, because I spent a lot of time in my car or at weird properties talking to people in the middle of the night about something stupid, like a dead pig in a pool. I worked on that plastic model kit for a Russian attack helicopter from Rambo 3. Another cinematic classic, brought to you by Vincent. And I think we're going to go into detail in another episode about my fascination with aviation and model making and art projects in general. But I'll go ahead and tell you now that I think it has some sort of calming effect on me, because one of my favorite memories of all time is being in Hancomer, Texas, working with my grandfather on model airplane kits. And most of you probably know my grandfather was a mechanic for the Navy for decades and could take apart and rebuild the engine of a F-4 Phantom fighter jet. And as you might expect, he was a bit of a stickler for details. And when we made the model kit, he taught me all the tricks about how to deal with the plastic flash, mold lines, and how to get some features of the engine right. We worked on a B-17 bomber. Probably wouldn't surprise anyone that he had an emotional connection to that airplane because of his experiences in World War II. And then another model that we worked on was for a Harrier. That is a vertical takeoff and landing fighter used by the Royal Air Force. So UK's Air Force has this really complex jet that can take off and land vertically. And it does it with a really complex engine that can change the direction of the vents. It makes it incredibly maneuverable, but the engine is extremely complicated and difficult to service and manufacture. And the cool thing is that it's built by Rolls-Royce. So it's a Rolls-Royce jet engine. And my grandfather loved this thing and showed me all the cool features about how the ducts could change direction. And we made sure that that engine was in good order, even though when we finished the model, it was going to be locked away inside. You'd barely be able to see it. But my grandfather would know it was there, and he would want it to be right. And that kind of sums up a big element of his personality. And so, another story that happened during spring break, I believe, when I was carrying the pager around. There's one story that relates back to, you know who, the Tridelts, the Delta 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 house. During spring break, I kept getting these alarm calls, and I would go out to the house and look around, and I wouldn't see anything. Nobody was supposed to be there. Everything was supposed to be shut down for spring break. But something kept setting off one of the interior motion detectors. And so when this kind of thing happens, you immediately think, well, it's a balloon that the air conditioning is blowing down the hallway, or foundation settling caused a door to move, or something like that. Or maybe a squirrel got in through some hole in the roof and is now tearing up the carpet somewhere in a hallway upstairs. After a few calls, I started to figure out that there was an animal of some kind in this one upstairs part of the building. And I noticed that some of the residents had left their doors open. That's not really recommended, but, it's fine. The house is all supposed to be locked down with daily patrols and motion detector alarms and that sort of thing. So the residents had the right to expect that no one was going to go through their stuff or steal anything. I mean, that's why I was there. And so, as a test, I did my little trick again. I put some food down on a plate at the end of a hallway, right where the motion detector was going to catch something if it was going to go to that plate and try to get some of the bait. And sure enough, eventually, my pager goes off. It's the Tried-Out house. I head out there, check the alarm panel. Sure enough, there's motion upstairs. I sneak up the stairs really quietly, and, ladies and gentlemen, we got him. It turns out it was an adorable little puppy that one of the residents was trying to keep in their room during the break. Somehow they thought that was going to work. And so they left a lot of food for it. But, of course, it was leaving the room and causing problems. So we contacted the management and they contacted the resident in question. And they got that situation sorted out. But for a while there, the Joker to my Batman was this little puppy that was hiding out in one of the rooms. Before we get too far along, I did want to mention a little bit about my time with Texas Student Television. And as I mentioned before, I was a radio, television, and film concentration person my first year with Plan 2. So I took the semester-long course on Jaws and how they made it. Everything from lens choices to editing choices. And the late 90s were a very interesting time for film majors. Like I said in previous volumes, Pulp Fiction had changed the scene quite a bit. People were not trying to make the next RoboCop anymore, or the next Die Hard. Now it had to be cool, and the dialogue had to be interesting, and it had to be about cool young people trying to make wild decisions in a crazy, chaotic world. It was not the time for earnest genre-style work that would return again in the late 2000s. Now, back then, nothing was digital. That's the biggest difference, I think, between now and then is back then, yeah, we had video toasters that could add special effects to magnetic tape recordings. Back then, the state-of-the-art, the stuff the pros used was what we called a 3/4 deck. And a 3/4 deck was a gigantic VCR designed to record on or play back these gigantic old-fashioned video cassettes with the extra wide tape. And theoretically, there was more magnetic material and they recorded a better picture. But let's face it, back in the days of broadcast TV or pre-high-definition cable, it didn't really matter. A lot of times we used what was called high 8. And this is a blast from the past. The electronics on camcorders started to become smaller and more miniaturized. And they did a good job of integrating really cheap lenses to bring the cost down. But the problem is, those giant VHS cassettes, any camcorder would have to have a big old tape deck of some kind, and that would create a lot of noise and weight and run your battery down. And bear in mind, back then, there was no memory card at all that could hold video. The capacity just wasn't there. And the first time I ever saw a memory card or flash data device was in the late 90s, and it was very expensive. And there was no way you were going to fit any kind of video on there. Maybe some very low-resolution digital images. And so to avoid all the weight with a VHS cassette deck, they invented this miniature videotape that they called High 8. And a High 8 tape was a little bit bulkier and bigger than an audio cassette tape, but it was less than half the size of a regular VHS tape. But the picture quality was about the same. And so that's why all of us intrepid camera persons working for Texas Student Television started using these high 8 camcorders, because they were a good option at the time. Instead of having to strap a VCR to your back like in the 80s, we were able to have these more portable options even before the age of digital, which was going to happen in a couple of years. I think I bought my first digital camera in 2001, so we're only a couple of years away from the revolution, but during this time, we're still using magnetic tape. So what did I do for Texas Student Television? I didn't edit tape. I did do some of the grunt work that you're expected to do, and one example of that is black bursting. Here's a case where I'm pretty sure most of you don't know what black bursting is. So, black bursting is something that you're supposed to do to a brand new magnetic video cassette. Since we had to use all this magnetic tape, one thing people noticed is that apparently, if you take a blank VHS or high 8 or 3/4 tape and you play it back, you get a bunch of snow, basically static. Now, if you were to record an image over that static directly, apparently some of the static would create a noisy effect in the image. In other words, the image wouldn't be recorded perfectly. And so what you did was you black bursted a tape. And what that means is you take a blank tape and you record a black screen over the entire cassette tape. Theoretically, when you do finally record an image onto that tape, since the snow pattern was already converted to a uniform black field, that supposedly makes the image sharper later on. So people would take brand new tapes, take them out of their packages, put them in a deck with a video signal that's a black field. They'll record that over the whole tape, take it out, label it as a black bursted tape, put it in a bin, open the next one, do the same thing, and of course you're running 4 or 5 tapes at the same time. And so that way, when the next camera person has gotten permission to use the equipment, they can grab one of those tapes and get a beautiful image. Well, a beautiful image of what? What kind of stuff were we recording? I was the camera person on a couple of attempted cable access shows, some comedies that we attempted to film with one camera inside a tiny apartment, and that was interesting. But I started to get interested in the news, and I worked with a journalism major who was this young woman who was about 5'1", but she was a bundle of energy and enthusiasm, and I thought we could get some good work done together. And so we found out that Jesse Jackson was going to be coming to campus to talk about some issue. And I'm sure most people remember Jesse Jackson from back then. And this raised the political temperature on campus already. And, of course, I wasn't interested in that very much. I was very fascinated with getting some really cool footage. So when we went to the building where Jesse Jackson was going to speak, we found out where the green room was, where he was staying before the speech. And so I set up my camera at this corner in the hallway where I was going to get this really good shot of Jesse Jackson coming out of the waiting area, walking toward the camera down this well-lit hallway. It was going to be like a shot from The Shining. It was very Kubrick. Lots of perspective down this long hallway with the white tile floor. Then he was going to turn right next to me, and I was going to get that great pivot shot where he starts walking towards the doors that the security people would open, and you would hear the crowd, and you'd get that backstage energy. And so I was all set up. And the idea was that he was gonna, as he walked toward me with his entourage, I was gonna pull focus masterfully on my little hi-8 camcorder. And it was gonna be kind of like that cool boxer entering the arena before the fight shot. The Paul Thomas Anderson shot. He does it a lot. Like in The Master, he has the Steadicam following right behind Philip Seymour Hoffman's right shoulder as he walks up to the stage to make his speech. It's dignified and heroic. It's not demeaning. Unless when the door of the green room opens and instead of Jesse Jackson and his entourage, it's just Jesse Jackson and one other guy. And he starts walking down the hallway, but he kind of stops halfway down the hallway. And Jesse Jackson kind of looks at me like, what the hell are you doing? And then he turns to his left and goes into the men's room. And at that point, I turn the camera off because I figure, oh, it's not speech time yet. So later, he comes out of the restroom and goes back into the waiting room. And I do eventually get my shot, but that first attempt was a little awkward. I think he knew what I was trying to do. He wasn't upset. Now, I gotta say, he didn't like us after the event because after his speech, the reporter found him at this reception and started badgering him with questions. And he wanted to sort of hand her over to one of his people who would answer some questions for her. But she said, well, you come on campus to bring your opinion about, these issues. And so here we are asking your opinion about blah, blah, blah. And basically hinting that she didn't want to talk to anyone else. And, Mr. Jackson was very gracious to her. And didn't want to generate any bad feelings, I guess. The whole thing had to do with voting drives. Man, thinking back to, what was going on politically back then, it was like another planet. None of the issues that you guys might be thinking about were on the table. No one was talking about trans anything. Nobody was talking about immigration on the level that we talk about now. It was primarily about voting drives and, getting young people registered to vote. I think it was, the lead up to the 2000 election. But boy, it was a relatively innocent time before 9/11. Before the Iraq War, before the financial crisis, and it's still really before the internet, as you guys can see. This was back when I joined a band by seeing an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper tacked to a corkboard in a hallway of a campus building where someone had printed out a phone number over and over and over again at the bottom of the sheet of paper. And so they just take some scissors and they cut between the phone numbers so that they make these convenient little tabs that you can tear off a strip at the bottom of the paper. And there you go. You've got one copy of that phone number that you can put in your pocket and call later when you get home because you don't have a phone in your pocket. That would be crazy. That's like Star Trek. In the real world, people have to go home to make a phone call. We'll talk about the band in the next episode, even though by this point, the band had kind of come and gone. In the next episode, we'll also have to talk about the Lano Bonanno show, which was this strange incident that happened as a result of my involvement with Texas Student Television. It's apparently a local talent show that they have in Llano. And for people outside of Texas, just know that the actual name of the town is spelled Llano. And so, yes, You guys have already heard me talk about the Rio Grande and a street called Guadalupe. So, yeah, these are the official Texas pronunciations of these towns. But at the Lano Bonanno show, there was some trouble that went down, and we'll talk about that. I ended up sleeping with a male friend of mine that I worked with at Texas Student Television. I mean, these things happen. I didn't plan on it. It's just that it turns out we were staying in a bed and breakfast that wasn't finished yet. And this was like February or something, and it was 20 degrees outside. And the room that Daniel and I were in, where we were supposed to be in 2 different beds, it didn't have windows yet. There were just big holes in the wall. And we didn't really have blankets or anything, so, you do what you gotta do to stay warm, But, yeah, that was a rough night. And so the next morning, I was supposed to be a camera person for a very bizarre local talent show in Variety Hour. And we'll talk about that next week. And so before we sign off, I want to talk about a guard that I'm going to call Mr. Green. Now, Mr. Green worked for the Church of Scientology.
Church of Scientology. Church of Scientology.
Along with the other guard who was the last namer. Obviously, this is not his real name. In the spirit of Reservoir Dogs, I'll use a color word for his name. And I chose green for a specific reason, because I'm pretty sure Mr. Green was selling green to residents during his shift. He always had this backpack, even though he wasn't a student, and he was very popular. And suffice it to say, I don't think Mr. Green studied his copy of Dianetics very closely. Selling a psychotropic drug like marijuana illegally on your job would be against the ethics of Scientology. They call that out ethics in Scientology. If you are not doing what you're supposed to do, if you're not following the ethical rules, you are what they call, quote, out ethics. And the goal is to get someone in ethics. So, I was never able to develop any proof that Mr. Green was carrying green in his backpack. But I was watching him closely. He tended to be real fast and loose with the rules, part of why he was so popular. I can guarantee you some of the girls got cereal after midnight when Mr. Green was on duty. And probably a lot more than cereal. And, given what he was selling, the sorority house probably went through a lot more cereal because of the changes in dietary habits that might come about because of the product that he was peddling. And he did have a kind of weird, laid-back, creepy enthusiasm that the house mothers seemed to respond to. It's that whole glib, I'm a cool guy, but yeah, I still follow the rules, but we can all get along. Hey, do you like my hairstyle kind of thing? Yeah, my shirt's kind of wrinkled, but I'm cool, right? It was that whole vibe. Didn't like it. The guy rubbed me the wrong way. This whole being nice to people and having fun and being pleasant, that shit's not gonna fly. Not on my watch. But Mr. Green was instrumental in the downfall of Zimco because of actions that he chose to take one fateful night. And we'll talk about that next week. I promise. I also am going to make another promise. I'm just full of these lame, empty promises that take forever to come to fruition, but I am working on the lyrics for another song, but this time, it's not a rap song. It's a country song. I thought I would shift things up. I think that would be a cool 180. And I will be singing that song. We'll see how that goes. But next week, we'll talk about the ending of Zimco and my being thrown to the wolves into the world of real security, where things actually get stolen and people actually get hurt. And Mr. Sorority security guard is going to have to grow up a little bit. That'll be in the next volume of Sorority Security Guard. I don't want to promise that the next episode will be another Sorority Security Guard episode. I think I might break and go for another subject for one episode and then come back. I don't know. We'll see. But until then, I'll talk to you later.